Millionaire pretends to be poor to test his fiancée, but what he discovers changes everything. Before the start of the story, comment below, which place are you watching us from today? Please enjoy the video. This is the story of a self-made millionaire who decided to hide his wealth to test his fiancée's loyalty. It started as a simple experiment, a way to know if her love was real. But what he uncovered shook him to his core. Meet Daniel, a man who seemed to have it all: a thriving business, luxurious cars, and a penthouse overlooking the city skyline. But behind his confident smile was a deep insecurity, one that no amount of wealth could fix. You see, Daniel had been burned before. Relationships, for him, always came with a price. People saw the wealth, the lifestyle, but rarely saw him. When he met Sarah, everything felt different. She was kind, down to earth, and didn't seem to care about the money. But doubt has a way of creeping in, doesn't it? Every little question, every small inconsistency in her reactions made him wonder, was it him she loved, or the life he could give her? That's when Daniel decided to take an extraordinary risk. He created a plan that would change everything. He would strip away his wealth, his status, and his entire identity. For 1 month, he would live as an ordinary man, a man struggling to make ends meet. He wanted to see Sarah's true heart, unclouded by his riches. What Daniel didn't expect was that the test would reveal more than he bargained for. It wasn't just about Sarah's loyalty, it became a journey that forced him to confront his deepest fears and insecurities. This story isn't just about Daniel and Sarah. It's about trust, vulnerability, and the unexpected ways life teaches us what really matters. Daniel's life was shaped by a single promise he made to himself when he was just a boy: "I will never let this happen to me again." That promise was born out of moments he wished he could forget. Nights when his mother cried over unpaid bills, mornings when his father left early to look for extra work, and afternoons when the landlord banged on their door. Growing up, poverty wasn't just an inconvenience for Daniel, it was a shadow that seemed to follow him everywhere. He remembered sitting in class, stomach growling as the other kids shared stories of vacations he could never dream of taking. He'd smile and pretend not to care, but inside, the embarrassment burned. That fire drove him. While other kids played video games or hung out after school, Daniel buried himself in books and part-time jobs. He had one goal: to escape the life he was born into. By the time he graduated college, he was already working on his first business, a small tech startup he ran out of his shared apartment. The early days were grueling. There were nights when he survived on instant noodles and weeks when his bank account flirted with zero. But Daniel had a gift, an unrelenting drive and a mind that could see opportunities where others saw dead ends. His breakthrough came when he developed a mobile app that streamlined project management for small businesses. Within 3 years, the app became a hit, earning millions in revenue. By 30, Daniel was living the kind of life he'd once only dreamed of. A sprawling penthouse, a sleek sports car parked in the garage, and the freedom to travel anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. But for all his success, Daniel couldn't escape the gnawing sense of loneliness. Relationships, whether romantic or platonic, came with complications. His wealth acted like a magnet. It drew people in, but not always for the right reasons. Time and time again, he found himself questioning whether people liked him for who he was or for what he could give them. One ex-girlfriend had summed it up perfectly, though not in a way she intended. "You're great," she'd said during their breakup, "but I just can't handle this lifestyle. It's too much." What stung wasn't the words but the realization that the lifestyle was all she'd ever really wanted from him. By the time Daniel met Sarah, he'd almost given up on the idea of finding someone who truly cared about him. Their meeting was serendipitous. She wasn't part of his usual crowd. There were no high-end parties, no exclusive networking events. It was a rainy afternoon, and Daniel had ducked into a small coffee shop to escape the downpour. She was there, too, nursing a mug of tea and reading a dog-eared novel. Their first conversation felt effortless. She teased him about his choice of coffee, black, no sugar, calling it the drink of serious people. He laughed, something he realized he hadn't done genuinely in a while. Over the weeks that followed, they continued to meet. Sarah was different. She didn't fawn over his car or his tailored suits. Instead, she asked about his childhood, his dreams, and even his fears. For the first time in years, Daniel felt seen, not as a millionaire or a CEO, but as a person. Their relationship blossomed quickly. She moved into his penthouse 6 months later, and Daniel found himself imagining a future with her. But as their relationship deepened, so did his insecurities. There were moments that made him pause. Like the way she seemed so at ease in his world of luxury, almost as if she'd always belonged there. Or the time she casually mentioned how lucky she was to have found someone with his resources. They were small comments, ones most people wouldn't think twice about. But for Daniel, they planted seeds of doubt. It wasn't just about Sarah, it was about his past. Every betrayal, every relationship that had ended because of his money, had left scars. He couldn't help but wonder, was Sarah different, or was she just better at hiding her intentions? One night, after a particularly tense dinner where Sarah had pressed him about their next big vacation, Daniel found himself unable to sleep. The thought kept looping in his mind, does she love me, or for what I can give her? It was then that the idea first took shape. What if he created a scenario where his wealth didn't exist? What if Sarah saw him not as a millionaire, but as an ordinary man? The more he thought about it, the more it felt like the only way to find the truth. The plan began to take form. He would step out of his world entirely, leaving behind his penthouse, his company, and his lifestyle. For 1 month, he'd live as a man struggling to make ends meet. He'd find a small apartment, take on a modest job, and tell Sarah it was all because of a financial crisis. If she stayed by his side, he'd know her love was real. If not, well, at least he'd have his answer. But as the plan solidified, so did the risks. What if Sarah felt betrayed by the lie? What if the relationship he was trying to save was destroyed by the test itself? Deep down, Daniel knew he was gambling with the one thing he cared about most. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was something he had to do. Trust, he realized, wasn't just about believing in someone else. It was about finding the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful it might be. And so, with a heavy heart, Daniel prepared to step into a life he hadn't lived in years. A life without wealth, without status, and perhaps without Sarah. Daniel's plan wasn't just bold, it was transformative. It would require him to step completely out of the life he had built, into a world that felt foreign and uncomfortable. But for Daniel, this was the only way to truly understand Sarah's intentions. The first step was creating a believable backstory. If Sarah was going to accept his sudden fall from wealth, the story had to feel real. He decided to tell her that his company had suffered a massive financial setback due to a failed merger. Overnight, his assets were frozen, and he had no choice but to start over from scratch. To make it convincing, Daniel spent hours creating fake documents, news articles, and even a phony bank statement showing his new financial reality. Next came the logistics. Daniel knew he couldn't keep living in his luxurious penthouse. It was too obvious a contradiction to his fabricated crisis. He found a modest studio apartment on the outskirts of town. It was a far cry from the life he was used to, peeling paint, a creaky bed, and a tiny kitchenette that barely had room for a microwave. The rent was cheap, but that was the point. He needed Sarah to believe he was struggling. To make the story even more convincing, Daniel took on a job as a clerk at a local hardware store. It wasn't glamorous, but it added to the illusion of starting over. For the first time in years, he found himself clocking in and out, wearing a uniform and answering to a boss. It was humbling, but it was all part of the test. Daniel also made changes to his appearance. He traded his tailored suits for second-hand jeans and worn-out sneakers. He let his neatly trimmed beard grow out and stopped visiting his barber. The goal was to erase the polished image of a successful CEO and replace it with someone who looked like they were just getting by. The hardest part, though, was preparing himself emotionally. Daniel wasn't just testing Sarah. He was stepping into a role that required him to suppress everything he'd worked so hard to achieve. For a man who had built his identity around his success, this was no small task. When the day came to tell Sarah about the financial crisis, Daniel rehearsed his lines until they felt natural. He invited her over to his penthouse for what he described as an important conversation. As she walked in, he could see the worry in her eyes. It was clear she sensed something was wrong. "I need to tell you something," Daniel began, his voice steady but tinged with nervousness. "Things haven't been going well at work. A deal I was counting on fell apart, and it's left me in a really bad position." Sarah's reaction was exactly what he expected, shock, followed by concern. "What does this mean for us?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "It means I can't afford to live here anymore," he replied. "I've already found a smaller place. I'll be moving out at the end of the month." He watched her closely, looking for any signs of disappointment or doubt. To her credit, Sarah seemed supportive at first. She reassured him that they'd get through it together and even offered to help him pack. But as the days went by, cracks began to show. When she visited his new apartment for the first time, her reaction was hard to miss. She tried to hide it, but Daniel could see the flicker of disapproval in her eyes as she took in the tiny, run-down space. "This is cozy," she said, forcing a smile. Daniel couldn't help but feel a pang of doubt. Was she just adjusting to the change, or was this the beginning of something deeper? Over the next few weeks, Daniel and Sarah's relationship entered uncharted territory. Their lavish dinners were replaced by takeout or simple meals cooked in his cramped kitchenette. Date nights turned into evenings spent watching TV on his second-hand couch. For Daniel, it was a stark contrast to the life they'd shared before. The hardware store job added another layer to the illusion. Daniel made sure to mention it frequently, describing the long hours and modest paycheck. He even invited Sarah to visit him there one day, hoping to gauge her reaction. When she arrived, dressed in her usual designer outfit, Daniel couldn't help but notice how out of place she looked. She smiled and greeted him warmly, but there was a hint of awkwardness in her demeanor. "This is where you work now?" she asked, glancing around the store. "Yes," he replied, trying to sound proud. "It's honest work, and it's helping me get back on my feet." Sarah nodded, but her silence spoke volumes. For Daniel, every interaction became a test. He paid close attention to her words, her body language, and even the tone of her voice. There were moments that gave him hope, like when she surprised him with a home-cooked meal after a long day. But there were also moments that fueled his doubts, like the time she hesitated before agreeing to spend the weekend at his apartment instead of going out. As the weeks went on, the emotional toll of the test began to weigh on Daniel. He found himself questioning not just Sarah's intentions, but his own motivations. Was this really about love, or was it about his fear of being vulnerable? Despite the doubts, Daniel pressed on. He knew the truth was within reach, and he was determined to see the plan through to the end. What Daniel didn't realize, however, was that the truth he was searching for might not be the one he was prepared to face. The test began with a delicate balance of deception and observation. Daniel had moved into his tiny apartment, started his modest job at the hardware store, and shared his story of financial ruin with Sarah. The hardest part was watching her reaction unfold over time, an intricate dance of support, hesitation, and subtle cracks that left Daniel questioning everything. At first, Sarah seemed eager to adapt. She visited Daniel's new apartment with a smile, carrying a small plant as a housewarming gift. "Every home needs a little green," she said, placing it on his windowsill. Daniel appreciated the gesture, though he couldn't help but notice how quickly her smile faded as she scanned the peeling wallpaper and scuffed floors. That week, Daniel invited her over for dinner. Unlike the gourmet meals they once enjoyed, he cooked a simple spaghetti dish. Sarah complimented it, but her polite words were accompanied by a faint sigh as she glanced around the cramped kitchen. "It's different," she admitted. "But it's cozy. We'll make it work." Her words were reassuring, yet Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Was she really adjusting, or was she merely tolerating this new reality? As the weeks went on, small but telling moments began to surface. One evening, Daniel suggested a walk through the nearby park instead of their usual nights out. Sarah agreed, but her enthusiasm seemed forced. "This is nice," she said, though her eyes lingered on the couples dining in nearby restaurants. Another time, while Daniel was getting ready for work, Sarah stopped by unexpectedly. She watched as he put on his hardware store uniform, a simple shirt with the company's logo. "You're really doing this, huh?" she asked, half smiling. "It's honest work," Daniel replied, trying to sound confident. "I'm lucky to have found something so quickly." She nodded but didn't respond. Her silence hung in the air, louder than any words she could have spoken. The first significant shift came during a conversation about their future. Sarah had always been a planner, often talking about trips they'd take or the house they'd buy one day. But now, those conversations had stopped. When Daniel brought up the subject, she hesitated. "I think we should focus on getting through this first," she said, her voice steady but distant. "There's no point in making big plans right now." For Daniel, this was both understandable and unsettling. He began to wonder, was she genuinely trying to be practical, or was she pulling back because the future she envisioned no longer seemed viable? Not all moments were filled with doubt. There were times when Sarah's actions seemed to reaffirm her commitment. One night, after a particularly long day at the hardware store, Daniel came home to find Sarah waiting for him with a warm meal. She had cooked his favorite dish, complete with a dessert she knew he loved. "I figured you could use a treat," she said, smiling. It was gestures like these that kept Daniel's hope alive. Despite the cracks, there were glimpses of the woman he had fallen for, someone who cared deeply and wanted to support him. To push the boundaries of his test, Daniel suggested a weekend staycation at his apartment. No fancy hotels, no dining out, just 2 days of simple living. Sarah hesitated at first but eventually agreed. They spent the weekend watching movies on his small TV, cooking together and playing card games. Daniel noticed her making an effort, but he could also see the strain. By the end of the weekend, Sarah seemed distant. As she left, she gave him a tight hug and said, "I'll see you later." Her tone was warm, but her expression told a different story. One of the most revealing moments came when Sarah visited him at work. Daniel had invited her to see the store, thinking it might give her a better understanding of his new life. She arrived wearing a stylish outfit that stood out starkly against the store's utilitarian backdrop. As she walked through the aisles, Daniel could see her discomfort. "This is different," she said, trying to sound upbeat. "It's not forever," Daniel replied, smiling. But the visit didn't last long. Sarah stayed for less than 20 minutes, making an excuse about needing to run errands. Daniel watched her leave, feeling a pang of disappointment. Another layer of the test emerged when Sarah introduced Daniel to some of her friends. In the past, Daniel's wealth had been a non-issue, but now he felt the shift in how her friends interacted with him. One friend, Emma, asked, "So, what do you do now, Daniel?" Daniel explained his job at the hardware store, keeping his tone neutral. Emma's polite nod couldn't hide her surprise. Later, Sarah apologized for Emma's reaction. She didn't mean anything by it, she said. She just doesn't understand. Daniel couldn't help but wonder, was Sarah defending him or was she embarrassed? As the weeks passed, Sarah's patience seemed to wear thin. She began making excuses to spend less time at Daniel's apartment. When he asked if something was wrong, she brushed it off, claiming she was just busy with work. But Daniel could see the distance growing. Their conversations became shorter, their plans fewer. The woman who had once been so engaged and supportive now seemed distracted, even withdrawn. Throughout the test, Daniel found himself grappling with his own emotions. He had expected this to be a test of Sarah's loyalty, but it was also testing his own resilience. The life he had built, the one he was so proud of, felt like a distant memory. Living as an ordinary man had forced him to confront not just Sarah's intentions, but his own insecurities. He began to question the fairness of his test. Was he putting Sarah in an impossible position? Was it even reasonable to expect someone to adapt so drastically, so quickly? The turning point came during a casual dinner at Daniel's apartment. As they ate, Sarah mentioned that she had been thinking about their relationship. "I've been wondering if we're on the same path," she said hesitantly. Daniel's heart sank. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "I just feel like things have changed," she replied. "And I'm not sure where we go from here." Her words were like a dagger, but Daniel forced himself to remain calm. This was what he had been waiting for, the moment when the truth would reveal itself. The moment of truth arrived in a way Daniel hadn't expected. For weeks, he had been watching Sarah carefully, searching for clues about her true feelings. Every conversation, every gesture, every subtle glance had been a piece of the puzzle. But what finally brought the picture into focus wasn't something Sarah said or did, it was what she didn't know he overheard. It was a Saturday evening, and Daniel had invited Sarah over for dinner. He had cooked a modest meal, grilled chicken and a simple salad, and the two sat at the small dining table in his cramped apartment. The conversation had been light at first, but Daniel noticed Sarah's growing unease. She seemed distracted, her responses shorter than usual. After dinner, Sarah excused herself to take a phone call. She stepped into the hallway just outside the apartment, assuming Daniel wouldn't hear. But his old apartment walls were thin, and her words carried clearly through the space. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," she said, her voice low but tinged with frustration. "I mean, I love him, but this isn't the life I signed up for." Daniel froze. He felt his chest tighten as the words sunk in. She continued speaking, her tone softer now, almost pleading. "It's just so hard to see him like this," she said. "He's not the man I fell in love with. I keep hoping things will change, but what if they don't?" When Sarah returned to the apartment, she acted as if nothing had happened. She smiled, sat back down on the couch, and picked up the conversation where they had left off. But Daniel couldn't focus. Her words replayed in his mind, each repetition cutting deeper. In that moment, he felt a wave of conflicting emotions, hurt, anger, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. Yet there was also a sliver of understanding. She hadn't said she didn't love him. She hadn't said she wanted to leave. But the life he had forced them into, this test he had orchestrated, was clearly breaking her spirit. The next day, Daniel decided to confront Sarah. He couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. He invited her over again, this time with a plan to reveal the truth. When she arrived, Daniel wasted no time. "I need to talk to you," he said, his tone serious. Sarah looked concerned. "What's wrong?" Daniel took a deep breath. "I overheard your phone call last night." Her face turned pale. "What do you mean?" "You said you didn't know how much longer you could do this," Daniel replied, his voice steady but pained. "That I'm not the man you fell in love with?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears. Daniel, I didn't mean for you to hear that. But you said it, he insisted. Is that how you really feel? She hesitated, wiping her eyes. It's complicated, she began. I love you, but everything has changed so quickly. I'm trying to adjust, but it's hard. I feel like I've lost the version of you I knew. Her honesty stung, but Daniel appreciated it. He decided it was time to reveal the truth. Sarah, he said, his voice softening, there's something you need to know. Everything that's happened, the financial crisis, this apartment, my job at the hardware store, it wasn't real. It was a test. She stared at him, her expression a mix of shock and disbelief. What are you talking about? I wanted to see if you loved me for who I am, not for what I have, Daniel explained. So, I created this situation to find out the truth. For a moment, Sarah said nothing. Then, slowly her shock turned to anger. You tested me? She asked, her voice rising. Do you have any idea how humiliating that is? How hurtful? I didn't mean to hurt you, Daniel said, his tone pleading. I just needed to know if our relationship was real. And what did you find out? She demanded. Daniel hesitated. I don't know, he admitted. That's why I'm telling you now. I want to understand how you really feel. Sarah stood up, pacing the room. Do you even hear yourself? She said, her voice shaking. You created a lie, an entire lie, just to test me. How am I supposed to feel about that? I thought I was protecting myself, Daniel said quietly. But now I see I might have destroyed what we had in the process. Sarah stopped pacing and looked at him. You don't trust me, she said. You never did. And now, I don't know if I can trust you either. Her words hit Daniel like a blow. For all his planning, all his efforts to uncover the truth, he hadn't considered what his test might cost him. After a long silence, Sarah spoke again, her tone softer but no less resolute. I need time to think, she said. I need to figure out if I can move past this. Daniel nodded, though his heart ached. Take all the time you need, he said. I just want you to know that I love you. I always have. She gave him a small, sad smile. I know, she replied. But sometimes, love isn't enough. As she left, Daniel felt an overwhelming sense of loss. The test had given him the truth he sought, but it had also revealed something deeper, that trust, once broken, is difficult to rebuild. Alone in his apartment, Daniel reflected on everything that had happened. He had started the test to protect himself, to ensure his love was real. But in doing so, he had hurt the one person he cared about most. For the first time, he realized that the problem wasn't just about Sarah's intentions, it was about his own fears and insecurities. He had built walls around his heart, convinced that love could only survive if it passed his conditions. In the end, the discovery wasn't just about Sarah. It was about him. The air in Daniel's small apartment was thick with tension. Sarah's words from the night before still rang in his ears. He had planned this test to uncover the truth, but now, as he prepared to confront her, he realized he might not be ready for what she had to say. When Sarah arrived that evening, she looked weary but determined. Daniel motioned for her to sit on the couch, and she did so cautiously, as though sensing the gravity of what was about to unfold. I need to talk to you, Daniel began, his voice steady but heavy with emotion. What's going on? Sarah asked, her eyes scanning his face for clues. Daniel took a deep breath. I overheard your phone call the other night, he said, his words deliberate. Sarah's face froze, her expression a mix of shock and dread. Who overheard me? I heard you say you didn't know how much longer you could do this, Daniel continued. That I'm not the man you fell in love with? Sarah's lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I didn't mean for you to hear that, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But you said it," Daniel replied, his tone soft but insistent. "And I need to understand what you meant." Sarah looked away, her fingers nervously twisting the hem of her shirt. "It's been hard," she admitted. "Everything changed so quickly. One day, we were planning vacations and talking about our future." She gestured vaguely at the apartment. "I get that," Daniel said. "But was it just the change in circumstances? Or was it me?" Sarah hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. "You're still you," she said. "But this version of you, it's different. You're not as confident, not as sure of yourself. And I miss that." Daniel felt a pang of guilt. The version of himself that Sarah missed was the one he had deliberately hidden. But her words also carried an accusation he couldn't ignore, that the test had stripped away more than just his wealth. "Sarah," he said, his voice trembling, "there's something I need to tell you. None of this is real. The financial crisis, this apartment, my job. It was all a test." Her head snapped up, her tear-filled eyes now wide with disbelief. "What?" "I needed to know if you loved me for who I am, not what I have," Daniel explained. "So, I created this scenario to see how you'd react." For a moment, Sarah didn't move. Then, slowly, her shock gave way to anger. "You tested me?" she asked, her voice rising. "You lied to me, made me believe you'd lost everything, just to see how I'd respond?" "I didn't know how else to find out the truth," Daniel said, his tone pleading. "The truth?" Sarah scoffed. "You think this is how you find the truth? By manipulating me? By breaking my trust?" Daniel flinched at her words. "I didn't mean to hurt you," he said quietly. "But you did," she snapped. "Do you have any idea how humiliating this is? How much I've been trying to support you, only to find out it was all fake." Her words cut deep, and Daniel struggled to respond. He had spent weeks orchestrating this test, convinced it was the only way to protect himself. But now, faced with Sarah's anger, he realized just how much he had underestimated the cost. "I thought I was protecting us," he said finally. "But I see now that I was wrong. I should have trusted you." Sarah let out a bitter laugh. "Trust? You talk about trust after what you've done." Daniel looked down, unable to meet her gaze. "I just wanted to know if what we had was real," he said softly. "And what did you find out?" she asked, her voice sharp. Daniel hesitated, his chest tightening. "I found out that I might have ruined the best thing I ever had," he admitted. The room fell silent again, the weight of his words hanging between them. Finally, Sarah stood up, her expression a mix of hurt and resolve. "I need time," she said. "I need to figure out if I can forgive this, if I even want to." Daniel nodded, though his heart ached. "I understand," he said. "Take all the time you need." As she walked to the door, she paused and turned back to him. "I loved you, Daniel," she said, her voice trembling. "But you made it impossible to know if that was enough for you." With that, she left, leaving Daniel alone in the quiet of his apartment. He sat on the couch, staring at the empty space where she had been moments before. For all his efforts to uncover the truth, Daniel realized he had learned more about himself than he ever expected. His fears, his insecurities, his need for control, they had all driven him to this moment. And now he was left to face the consequences of his actions. The door clicked shut behind Sarah, and Daniel sat in the silence of his tiny apartment, feeling the weight of her absence like a physical blow. He had imagined this moment countless times, how the test would end, how the truth would come out, but he hadn't prepared for the emptiness that followed. The woman he loved was gone, and for the first time, he wasn't sure if she'd come back. The first few days after Sarah's departure were unbearable. Daniel found himself replaying their last conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every glance, every tremble in her voice. He had wanted clarity, but all he had was regret. He kept his phone close, hoping for a message, a call, anything. But Sarah's silence was deafening. When a week passed without any contact, Daniel began to accept that he might have lost her for good. He threw himself into his work at the hardware store, using the physical labor to distract himself from the turmoil in his mind. Each box he lifted, each shelf he stocked, felt like penance for the pain he had caused. But no matter how hard he worked, the guilt lingered. One evening, unable to contain his thoughts, Daniel sat down to write Sarah a letter. "Dear Sarah," he began, the words spilling onto the page. "I know I hurt you, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I need you to know that everything I did came from a place of fear. I was afraid of losing you, afraid of being loved for the wrong reasons. And in trying to protect myself, I ended up hurting the one person I care about most." He poured his heart into the letter, recounting his childhood struggles, his insecurities, and the reasons behind his test. He wrote about the things he admired in her, her kindness, her strength, her ability to make him laugh even in his darkest moments. When he finished, he folded the letter and placed it in an envelope. But he didn't send it. Something held him back, the fear that his words would only reopen the wounds he had caused. As the weeks passed, Daniel began to confront the deeper truths about himself. The test he had orchestrated wasn't just about Sarah, it was a reflection of his own insecurities. He had spent years building a life of success and wealth, but beneath it all, he had never felt truly worthy of love. He sought validation through control, believing that by testing Sarah, he could eliminate any doubts about their relationship. But in doing so, he had overlooked the most important aspect of love, trust. Daniel realized that trust wasn't something you tested, it was something you gave. It was a risk, a leap of faith. And he had failed to take that leap with Sarah. One day, Daniel received an unexpected visit from an old friend, Michael. They hadn't spoken in years, but Michael had heard about Daniel's situation through mutual acquaintances. "I heard you've been going through something," Michael said as they sat in the small living room. Daniel laughed bitterly. "That's one way to put it." Michael listened as Daniel recounted the entire story, from the test to Sarah's departure. When he finished, Michael leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You know," Michael said, "you were so focused on proving Sarah's love that you forgot to prove your own. Love isn't about tests, it's about showing up, being there, and trusting the other person to do the same." His words struck a chord with Daniel. For the first time, he began to see the situation from Sarah's perspective, the betrayal she must have felt, the humiliation of being tested, the erosion of trust in their relationship. Inspired by his conversation with Michael, Daniel decided to take a different approach. He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to make amends. He returned to his old penthouse, which had been sitting empty during the test, and began to transform it into a space that reflected their shared memories. He filled it with the little things Sarah loved, her favorite flowers, the books she always talked about, the framed photos of their happiest moments together. But this time, he didn't rely on grand gestures. Instead, he focused on the small, meaningful details that showed he had been listening, that he truly knew her. A few weeks later, Daniel was walking home from the hardware store when he spotted Sarah across the street. She was sitting at an outdoor cafe, sipping coffee and staring into the distance. For a moment he hesitated. Should he approach her? Would she even want to see him? Gathering his courage, Daniel crossed the street and stopped a few feet away. "Sarah," he said softly. She looked up, her expression unreadable. "Daniel," she replied, her tone neutral. "Do you have a minute?" he asked. She nodded and he sat down across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Daniel broke the silence. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said. "About us, about what I did. And I realized something important." "What's that?" Sarah asked, her voice guarded. That I didn't trust you, Daniel admitted. And that was my biggest mistake. I let my fears and insecurities get in the way of what we had. And I'm sorry for that. Sarah's eyes softened, but she didn't respond immediately. It's not just about trust, she said finally. It's about respect. What you did, it made me feel like I wasn't enough, like I had to prove myself to you. I know, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. And I hate that I made you feel that way. If I could go back and do things differently, I would. But all I can do now is try to make it right. Their conversation lasted for hours, stretching into the evening as they talked about everything. The test, their relationship, their fears, and their hopes. By the time they parted ways, there was no clear resolution, but there was a sense of possibility. Daniel knew he couldn't fix things overnight. Trust, once broken, would take time to rebuild. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. He was willing to do the work, to show Sarah that his love was real, and to take the leap of faith he had been too afraid to take before. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's life began to settle into a new rhythm. The test, the confrontation, and the fallout had left scars, but they also opened the door to growth and self-reflection. He spent his days working at the hardware store, not because he needed to, but because the routine grounded him. His evenings were quieter now, often filled with long walks or moments spent journaling, a habit he'd picked up to process his emotions. But even in this new rhythm, there was one piece missing: Sarah. One crisp autumn afternoon, Daniel found himself at the park where he and Sarah used to take long walks. The leaves had turned vibrant shades of red and gold, and the air carried a gentle chill. As he strolled along the familiar path, he noticed a figure sitting on a bench near the pond. It was Sarah. Her presence caught him off guard. She was bundled in a soft coat, her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. She looked serene, yet there was a hint of sadness in her expression. Summoning his courage, Daniel approached her. "Mind if I join you?" he asked softly. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. For a moment she said nothing, then gestured to the empty space beside her. They sat in silence for a while, the quiet only broken by the distant sounds of children playing and leaves rustling in the wind. Finally, Sarah spoke. "How have you been?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unfriendly. "I've been learning," Daniel replied honestly. "About myself, about what I did, and about what I need to do differently." She nodded, her gaze fixed on the rippling water. "It hasn't been easy for me either," she admitted. "I've had a lot to think about." Daniel took a deep breath. "Sarah, I know I hurt you. And I know I might never fully fix that. But I want you to know that I've changed, not for you, but because I needed to. I see now that trust isn't about proving or testing. It's about believing. And I failed at that." Her eyes met his, and he could see the conflict in her expression. "It wasn't just about the trust," she said. "It was about feeling respected, feeling like an equal partner in the relationship. What you did made me question whether I ever had that." "You're right," Daniel said. "And I can't change the past. But if you're willing, I'd like to try to build something new with you, something better." Sarah didn't respond right away. Instead, she took a sip of her coffee, her thoughts clearly racing. Finally, she spoke. "I don't know if we can go back to what we had," she said. "But maybe we don't need to. Maybe it's about finding something new." Her words sparked a glimmer of hope in Daniel's chest. "I'd like that," he said. They spent the next hour talking, not about the test or their past mistakes, but about the little things that had once brought them together, their favorite books, the places they wanted to visit, the dreams they still carried. It felt like a rediscovery, a small step toward rebuilding the connection they had lost. Over the following weeks, Daniel and Sarah began to see each other more often. There were no grand gestures or dramatic declarations, just quiet moments of honesty and vulnerability. Daniel made it a point to show her that he valued her not as a part of his life, but as an equal in it. One evening, as they walked through the city, Daniel turned to Sarah. "I know it'll take time to rebuild what we lost," he said. "But I'm willing to take that time, as long as you're willing to take it with me." Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "I think I am," she said. In the end, Daniel's journey wasn't just about discovering Sarah's intentions, it was about discovering his own. He had spent so much of his life building walls to protect himself from being hurt that he had forgotten what it meant to be vulnerable. Through the pain and the mistakes, he learned that love isn't about certainty or guarantees. It's about taking a leap of faith, about trusting another person even when it feels terrifying. And for Daniel, that was the greatest lesson of all. As he and Sarah walked hand in hand through the bustling streets, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Daniel's story isn't just about love, wealth, or betrayal. It's about trust, vulnerability, and the courage to face our own flaws. Through his journey, he learned that love isn't something you test, it's something you nurture. It's not about proving someone else's loyalty, it's about believing in it. While Daniel and Sarah's future remains uncertain, one thing is clear: their story reminds us that relationships are built on more than just feelings. They require trust, respect, and the willingness to grow, both together and apart. How would you rate this story on a scale from 0 to 10? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Be sure to explore more emotional stories by clicking on the end screen.